Good afternoon. Welcome to World Oregon's webinar as part of our Great Decisions programs with the Foreign Policy Association. Today's webinar is on Myanmar and ASEAN, an important topic. You might have seen some of the strong press coverage in many national and international publications. It is a challenging issue and one that our speaker will dive into here shortly. But before we go into today's program, just a thank you to all of you who are members of World Oregon, who help make programs like this possible. If you're not a member, I encourage you to do so at worldoregon.org. We're about the midpoint of the Great Decisions program. If you missed a previous program, you can find them up on our YouTube page, which is linked to our website. It's also in the Know Before You Go email that you receive. And for here on out, we will not be selling the series tickets. We'll be selling the individual tickets for each event for the member and the non-member price. If you already have the series tickets, then that's great. It'll last for the rest of the series. If you ordered a book through the Foreign Policy Association, please note that some of those have been delayed in shipping just because of backlogs. We do not have any of the books. There are some exciting discussion groups coming up as part of this. We'll post later the links on those. It's also on our website, along with other events upcoming, most notably one with Professor Nichols of Oregon State University about the pandemic becoming endemic and looking back at the 1918 Spanish flu and all of that. He is always a top-notch speaker and encourage you to join us for that. Now, today's program. Today's program, again, is on Myanmar, also known as Burma, and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Our speaker is Daniel Sullivan, who's the Deputy Director for Africa, Asia, and the Middle East at Refugees International. He has a great deal of experience in working in areas affected by mass displacement. He has a master's degree from an excellent program, the Johns Hopkins SAIS program, otherwise known as the School of Advanced International Studies, as well as a bachelor's from Harvard. He's been published in numerous journals, a speaker in many areas. It's an honor to have Mr. Daniel Sullivan here today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Derek. And hello, everyone. And thank you for joining this, what I think is a really timely, important discussion. It comes on the week that we marked the 1 year since the Myanmar coup, military coup. So I'm going to get into that a little bit, and then also on ASEAN, where also timely, where we saw just yesterday the latest president or leading of the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian group that has really been playing the point and looked at as the lead to tackle what's happening in Myanmar. Hun Sen from Cambodia, who has made some controversial moves that we'll talk about, just yesterday announced that the foreign minister from Myanmar will not be invited to the upcoming ASEAN foreign ministers meeting. So that's a change and something that's welcome, although we'll get into how little really has been done on the ASEAN side. But just to start out, just to give you an idea of where I'm coming to this, I've been working on Myanmar for a number of years, but came at this from a background in atrocity prevention and genocide prevention, where I had previously worked with Save Darfur and worked for a group called United to End Genocide, where we started looking around the world where were the biggest risks, and this was around between like 2012, 2014, and I traveled with the person who now is the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights on Myanmar, and we came out with a report with a group called ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights, which has been very vocal recently on Myanmar and the dangerous signs around what was happening to the Rohingya. And the basic conclusion of that was that nowhere in the world were there more known precursors to genocide than in Myanmar at that time, particularly involving the Rohingya minority. And then fast forward a little bit to 2017, where we saw the mass attacks and expulsion of the Rohingya into Bangladesh, which was genocide. And then, so I've been working on that and advocating around on those kinds of issues with Refugees International for the past 5 years. And just a quick word on Refugees International, that we're an independent advocacy organization based in the United States in Washington, D.C. We don't have operations on the ground, and we don't take any government or UN funding, which allows us to be a little more independent. And Refugees International has been working on these issues since the late 1970s. So that's sort of where I've come at it. I've seen where I followed the political issues that have developed, and I'll go into that a little bit. But first, let me give a quick kind of introduction of where in the world we're looking at for those who may not be as familiar with the region. And let me just share my screen in 1 second. Okay. So if you look at this this map, this is a very recent one that, the small numbers show the numbers of displacement. This came from the UN Refugee Agency. And it just shows, I'll talk about this a little later, about just the trajectory of displacement that we've seen in the country. But you can also see from this map that, Myanmar is a very kind of strategic geopolitical location between China and India, and with a long border with Thailand. And so ASEAN is very much, it makes sense that ASEAN would be looked to lead on this. But we'll get into some of the reasons why that's kind of a challenge. The other thing to point out, and I'll talk about a little bit later, is the big rivalries between the geopolitical rivalries, and with the U.S. and China. There's a whole history of vying for influence in the region, and in Myanmar in particular, or Burma as it's called. So I'll come back to that map a little bit later. But today I'd like to just cover 3 main things. One is where we are, why this is an important moment, and this kind of builds on if people read there's a read ahead related from Hunter Marston that gave a really good background of where things were, but so much has happened in the last couple of months. So I'll look at what has happened more recently. And then secondly, who are the major players here? Obviously ASEAN, but where's the US, China, and others? And then finally, with where we are, what are the potential paths forward? Where's this crisis going, and what potentially could be done? So just to start with where are we? Why is this important? I mentioned this week, February 1st, we marked the 1 year mark from the day that the Myanmar military took over. This is, there's been a lot of international attention on this, but there was really, in this week, you've probably seen in the news just a plethora of statements and things that were made from everyone from President Biden to the UN Secretary General to the UN Security Council came out with a press statement, couldn't come to a stronger kind of action. New sanctions were announced by the US, UK, and Canada, and there has been some movement, but still not really the kind of attention and action that needs to be, the pressure that needs to be put on the military junta to change things. One of the big things that has changed recently is that there's been a long time push for sanctions to include the oil and gas sector, which is where the military junta gets some $1 billion worth of revenue each year. And it was a pretty significant move that we saw that Chevron and Total both pulled out or announced that they're going to pull out of Myanmar. That is very good news, but it also doesn't go all the way, because there are partners in Thailand, in part of the conglomerates that work on oil and gas, that if they simply take over from Chevron and Total, that those revenues will continue to go. So there's also a need for, and something that Chevron welcomingly and Total talked about, is welcoming sanctions that make it very clear what can and cannot go to Myanmar. So that was a pretty significant recent development. The other thing I would point out is that this is a multi-dimensional crisis, right? There's obviously a political crisis, a human rights and atrocity crisis. And there is a health crisis with, the country was ravaged by COVID-19 last year, and there's indications that a new wave could be coming soon. And this is happening in a country that already had a really underdeveloped health infrastructure, something that was, there were efforts being put in to build that up, but it really has been just directly made worse by the military junta since it took over. Directly aiming at and targeting health workers. Many of the health workers were at the front lines of the strikes and the protests that came out immediately after the junta. And so there's been that kind of blocking. There's been blocking of aid getting into the country. So you have that health crisis as well. And then you have an economic crisis due both to the mismanagement by the junta, by these massive strikes and boycotts by the protest movements, and just the general chaos that has has ensued. So you have people, almost half of the population that is estimated to be under the poverty level or heading towards being under the poverty level. And then finally, it's a humanitarian crisis. And with the work that I do with Refugees International, that's something that we really focus on, but it deserves its own kind of focus, where we have seen the latest numbers of at the beginning, pre-coup, there were an estimated 1 million people who were estimated to be in need of humanitarian aid. After the coup, in the first few months, that tripled to 3 million people. And now the latest estimates for looking into 2022 is that more than 14 million people are going to be in need of humanitarian aid. And that is, a large part of that is due to the direct blocking of aid or disrupting of aid by the military junta. So that's something that really needs to be addressed. There's also the displacement that's happened. The number of people displaced within the country has more than doubled. More than 400,000 people have been displaced since last year due to the fighting and the attacks by the junta and fighting between the junta and the various ethnic armed organizations and people's defense forces. And a lot of that, the attacks by the military have been on civilians, whether through aerial bombardment or mass burning of villages. We've seen that continue even in recent days. We've seen horrible attacks. I mean, one example was on Christmas Eve, there was an attack that killed 35 civilians, and that included a couple of aid workers who worked for Save the Children, and a few children as well. And there were, people were bound and tortured and then killed. And that's just a small snapshot of the larger issues and abuses that have gone on. The numbers dead and killed over the last year is at least 1,500 people, and that's not including all of the military fighting. That's just civilians, and that's a conservative estimate. And then over 11,000 have been detained, and many of those have been killed or tortured. So a really grim kind of picture coming 1 year since the military came in. But I think one thing to talk about is the military really did miscalculate here. I don't think they anticipated the level of protest and resistance. And so it leaves us in this really dangerous place where it's tough to see where exactly things are going to go beyond continued fighting. But no indications that in the near term, either the military can get control of the entire country, or that the opposition can immediately stop the military. Just going back to the background and read ahead without going into too much, but I think a couple of things worth highlighting from as far as background on the history of what's happened in Myanmar. I think, important to realize that there's a long history of decades of the Myanmar military having influence and within Myanmar and really being in charge. It was, for decades, and attacking different groups. There's a whole dynamic of the sort of center periphery where many of the ethnic armed groups are, and ethnic armed organizations who have been pushing back are in all different parts of the country. And we see in this moment, in more than at any other time, where the military's actions have really started to unify all those different groups. I think, some of the reasons given for, why did the military decide to do this at this time? I admit I was among those who was surprised, not completely surprised that the military would do something like this, but the timing of it, this was there were the risk factors there. The Aung San Suu Kyi's National League of Democracy had won it at the polls and was set to, set up a new government that was, further kind of marginalizing the military. But really, the military still controlled so much of the economy, key parts of the key ministries. In the Constitution they had written, 25% of the seats in the parliament were guaranteed for the military, and it took more than 75% of votes to change that constitution. So really, they were in kind of a good spot in terms of not getting as much international pressure, international businesses starting to come in, and having Aung San Suu Kyi as sort of and the NLD as a more friendly face ahead of that, who and we can talk a little bit about Aung San Suu Kyi as well. She even was defending the military before the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide and what was done to the Rohingya. So in some ways, I say it was somewhat surprising, and I think looking back, they miscalculated. I think that was covered a little bit in the read ahead. One thing I would add to that, though, is I think there was very much a personal dimension there between the military leader Min Aung Hlaing and Aung San Suu Kyi, and not Aung San Suu Kyi not being willing to meet with him in the run up to this. Just lingering tensions that had been there. I think that was part of it. Hunter in the read ahead also talks about which is interesting, the general trend towards authoritarianism in the region and among ASEAN countries. And I think it shouldn't be too surprising that the countries that are identified by Freedom House as not free within the ASEAN bloc are the very same ones who are more defending or less willing to push on Myanmar. So that includes Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos, whereas countries that are considered more free, like Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, have been pushing back much more. So that's just I think a couple of things that are interesting to take a look at. The other thing I would have highlighted more in a background, and again, it's partially because it's where I come from, though, come to this from, is how the Rohingya fit into this. The attacks on the Rohingya in 2017 were genocide. We've been pushing the United States to recognize that. They've said that it was ethnic cleansing. It's really important to recognize what happened for what it was. There was a UN report that laid out all the reasons why this was there. We at Refugees International and others have made the argument for why it is genocide, and why it's important to recognize that, because you need to address the impunity of the military, which helped to incentivize them to go even further as they have. So that's a really important thing to remember, is the importance of going after that accountability. And one of the interesting things also on the Rohingya is that you have, since this military coup, there's actually been more empathy from the other groups within Myanmar, the other ethnic groups who are showing, an understanding and recognition of what happened to the Rohingya, because they're seeing similar kind of things happening to them now, and that could be a really positive thing for the future, for a more inclusive government, as we hopefully get past where we are right now. So that's kind of covers a lot of like where we are right now. I want to cover two more things. One is who are the main players? Who is ASEAN? What are they doing here? And let me just see. Oh, actually, let me just to break things up a little bit, share a couple of charts and photos. I talked about the Rohingya. I want to show you right here, share a photo that I took. This was, in 2017, in the days after the genocidal attacks, where you had 700,000 plus Rohingya who fled across the border from Myanmar into Bangladesh. This just kind of gives a little snapshot of where, how things were, and just devastating stories, which just, again, reiterates the importance, I think, we need to, of why that genocide needs to be recognized. And then again, about the point of the need for to include the Rohingya in anything going forward. And then the other chart I wanted to show, or a couple other photos. One was on, when I visited Kachin State in Northeast Myanmar a few years ago. This is a photo just to give you an idea of, when we're talking about the people who've been displaced, and the numbers, it can become a bit abstract, but these are, camps, IDP camps that had been there for several years, but now, as I said, those numbers have more than doubled. And when you talk to the people who've been displaced, and I spoke, we had a media call last week to try to draw some attention to this with some civil society leaders along the border with India and Myanmar, and along the border with Thailand and Myanmar, and just sharing the really personal stories of how people they work with, how they have been attacked, beaten, or arrested, the bombings that they've seen, and so just want to pause for a second to give recognition to that personal experience that so many people are having, and and this is just one example of some of the camps. The ones that are there now are just so chaotic, because there's been such a quick uptick in the number of people displaced. And just to highlight that, I'll share one last chart. That kind of tells you, it shows you the trajectory that we're looking at here. Let me just see if I can find it. Okay, I'll come back to that. So it's really just about the extent, how much of an uptick we've seen in the number of people who have been displaced, and that is, we're now at 400,000 people who've been displaced, and we've seen a steady uptick. That's, the graph's sort of going like this in recent months, so we know that this humanitarian crisis is in a really dangerous trajectory. So back to the ASEAN, as I mentioned, there's been a split. There's been a sort of the actors who have been involved with this have been there's been a shuffling of chairs, really the same actors but different people. So previously Brunei had been leading ASEAN. Now Cambodia is in. Cambodia kind of erased some of the ASEAN pressure where they had not invited Myanmar officials to their summits by visiting. Hun Sen, the Cambodian president, visited Myanmar and met with Min Aung Hlaing, and that was met with major pushback because he hadn't checked with his ASEAN counterparts. Major pushback by particularly Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as Vietnam, and so that kind of led to a backtracking. And now the foreign minister from Myanmar has not been invited to the next ASEAN summit for foreign ministers. So that is a good thing. The bad thing is that there was a 5-point consensus plan that the ASEAN put forward very late after the coup. We've seen hardly any kind of action moving forward towards that, towards those goals, including meeting with, allowing humanitarian access, meeting with the envoy from ASEAN, and so there's been not much done by ASEAN, yet the international community continues to sort of wait for ASEAN to lead. And so that's a problem. In the UN Security Council, you have Russia and China who have really blocked any more forceful action. Although the UN General Assembly did pass a resolution that called for, in all but words, an arms embargo. And those are the kind of measures we need. And we need the United States to step up with the more like-minded allies in Southeast Asia and elsewhere to push for further targeted sanctions, coordinated, an arms embargo. And then the last thing is accountability measures. And that includes, as I mentioned, recognizing what happened to the Rohingya as genocide. So those are kind of the main players and where they are. The last thing I'll mention in just quickly a couple minutes is, so where are we going? The short answer is the trajectory is does not look very good. I think we're in a place where we're going to continue to see these attacks by the military. We're going to see resistance. We're going to see a continued uptick in displacement and in the humanitarian needs. And we're going to, it's not going to be clear for a long time where the dust is going to settle. That said, there are things that can be done right now to try to at least mitigate the suffering in the near term, and to push towards more dialogue and a cessation of fighting or attacks on the side of the Myanmar military in particular. There's a new special envoy, a UN special envoy from the region who's been appointed. She came under some fire recently because made some comments suggesting, that there should be, that kind of suggesting that all sides were responsible and needed to stop the fighting, and that there should be a power sharing arrangement, not recognizing really the so many people in Myanmar who just cannot see the military as a part of the main partnership for the future. But one of the things that really can be done and must be done most immediately is providing more aid, and especially cross-border. So working with Thailand, India, and even China to try to push them to allow cross-border aid. And then making sure that when people are fleeing from Myanmar, that they are they're not pushed back into the country. We've heard reports from Thailand that there's pressure for people to go back. We want to make sure that those countries live up to their international standards and are providing refuge to people who are seeking, who are fleeing from this violence. So those are all really important things that need to be done. There in the U.S., we have there's a lot of efforts on the Burma Act, which contains a lot of this, the humanitarian assistance being authorized, the need for arms embargo sanctions, the need for better coordination internationally, and then the need for accountability, including that genocide determination on the Rohingya. And Senator Merkley has been a big champion of that, as have many others. But that really needs to be moved forward. So on that, I think I'll wrap up, and I'm happy to talk about any aspect of that people are interested in hearing more on. But thank you for tuning in, and I'll open up to Q&A.
Great, thank you, Daniel. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs for WorldOregon. So ASEAN is being represented by a Cambodian leadership and previously Brunei, neither of which have a particularly strong record on human rights issues. Yet the US, UN, and others in the international community have consistently stated that the solution to the coup and the restoration of the path to democracy should be done through ASEAN's 5-point consensus. And you had just mentioned the concern about the political will of ASEAN member states with authoritarian governments. Why is the international community sticking with ASEAN as the solution? And what problems do you foresee with this as a continuing strategy?
Yeah, I think it, on a basic level, it reflects an international approach we've seen elsewhere when there's, regional crises in Africa, looking at the African Union or ECOWAS or other regional groups to take the lead. The problem is that ASEAN has not been, is not a grouping that usually is too forward leaning on these kinds of things, and they have no playbook when there is a coup. And as you mentioned, several of the countries who are parts of ASEAN have horrible human rights records or have had their own coups, and so they don't really have an interest in pushing too far. And I do think that there's some bright spots in that it's given ASEAN's past record, it is somewhat remarkable that they would not invite Myanmar's representatives. That is a pretty strong sign, and also that when Cambodia went forward and tried to just say, okay, we're gonna talk to the military and we're gonna go forward, that there was major pushback from within ASEAN on that. So I think there's some positive things there. There's going to be a U.S. ASEAN summit coming up next month, and that will be an opportunity for the U.S. to really push ASEAN more on this. But I think the simple answer is that there's both like a pattern of wanting to allow regional groups to take the lead on these kinds of issues, but there's also, there's a logjam at the UN Security Council with Russia and China more siding with the military and blocking any more stringent action, and then other countries not wanting to be too much in the lead here. But I think the U.S. has an important role to play there, where they should be working with allies, and I know they have in terms of working with Thailand on things like cross-border and engaging India and others. But they're, I think trying to get more coordinated global targeted sanctions and arms embargo and putting more diplomatic heft on that, and working, as I said, with those countries within Southeast Asia who are willing to be a little more forceful and recognize the true how dire the situation is.
Well, so you mentioned the U.S., and I'm curious. In December, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that the U.S. was exploring, quote, additional actions against the ruling military junta in Myanmar. What does this mean, and what do you think it's going to look like?
Yeah, we've seen a little bit of that in recent days, where there were new sanctions, targeted sanctions, new individuals and organizations added just in the last few days. New business guidance that's going to give a little more pause to businesses that may want to continue to work with anybody affiliated with Myanmar. And I think we know that a number of U.S. senior officials over the last year have traveled to the region, including the Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas Greenfield, and the State Department Counselor Derek Chollet, all raising these issues. And Derek Chollet at an event earlier this week said, we've added these new sanctions, and we're not going to stop here. We're going to continue to do it. So what I hope that includes is further sanctions on the oil and gas sector. And I hope that includes further coordination with other countries, getting more countries involved. And I hope that the talks with Singapore, which really controls a lot of the banking flows, and with Thailand can bear some fruit. So I think those are the kind of pressure points that they're talking about. And then on the other side, on the humanitarian side, I think they're continuing to press for cross-border aid to get through. But that's something that really that needs to happen right away. And just one other note, that particularly in Thailand, there's a whole a network of local civil society groups that have done this and who have connections, who can do this. So It's just working with the Thai authorities to allow that aid to get in.
So one of the things you touched on this, but I think it's the question that a lot of us wonder about. I mean, especially if we've been following these issues for 20 or 30 years. But Aung San Suu Kyi, once the sort of darling of democracy movements, where is she? And has her previous dismissal of Rohingya issues delegitimized her influence or standing with pro-democracy circles? And I'm wondering also, can you talk about her very surprising defense of the military's actions at The Hague?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, on the one side, where we are today, in terms of within Myanmar itself, she continues to be somebody that the pro-democracy folks are looking to, and internationally as well. It's right now where she stands is she's in prison. She's been accused with all kinds of trumped up charges that will have her in prison for over 100 years. And so really taking on more of that role of being the person who was a representative of democracy in Myanmar, that the international community and people within Myanmar could again rally around. But it's complicated by the real history of what's gone on, and this, when I think a lot of times right now over the past year, when people look at where the military is and they try to summarize how things have changed since, say, 2010, 2012, people talk about an opening from the previous decades of military dictatorship. And it's very much true that there was, I think what many people would describe as sort of a honeymoon period, but it wasn't really a honeymoon. I mean, there were positive things like more openings, civil society within Myanmar was growing. There were more press freedoms, although those started to get rolled back. Release of hundreds or thousands of political prisoners. So some positive things, but at the same time, there were still, attacks against ethnic minority groups. I remember, on the day that Aung San Suu Kyi was voted into parliament after she had been released from house arrest, there was shelling in villages in Kachin State. And then the most damning one is, of course, like what happened to the Rohingya, where Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD party were in charge at that time. And it was the military that really carried out the attacks, but they had influence, and Aung San Suu Kyi in particular had incredible influence with the international community. But she chose, in her own words, saying, "I'm not a human rights icon. I'm a politician," and she made that decision to pursue that path, and really, by all accounts, just became more and more authoritarian in the way that she was going about things. And even made the calculation that it would make sense to defend defend the military against genocide charges in The Hague. So it gets a bit complicated with, right now she is the one who, everybody's looking at the military as the main problem, obviously, and that very understandably that's true. But when, there's also, it's a bit more complicated with Aung San Suu Kyi than just how it had been in the past, where she was the human rights democracy icon who was going to provide the path to this more democratic and inclusive society. There's some serious questions there that will have to be dealt with in the future.
So The Economist has been reporting some coalescing of resistance groups on tribal and ethnic grounds. Can you comment on prospects of some more unified opposition and some of the reported shift for some of these groups from a nonviolent resistance to an armed resistance?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important to point out that, in the wake of the coup, the first thing that happened was massive nonviolent protests that were going on, and people banging pots and pans in protest, people doing strikes or boycotts of the not drinking the beer that the Myanmar military manufactured, not buying at certain shops, those kinds of things. and people turning out in huge numbers. But what it was the military cracked down on that, and their force, the way that they did that, really pushed people to decide to take up arms. And the national unity government that was set up, and this is the people who were elected in the last election, but were deposed by this coup. They formed a government in opposition, and they really have a claim to that because they were voted in that election. They were at first were very much pushing along peaceful lines as well. Then we saw the end of last year where they felt, whether because not seeing enough support from the international community, seeing stepped up attacks by the military, they called for a people's defensive war. So they made that calculation to turn towards trying to further, unify some of the people who had already, the localized people who had already taken up arms, to try to pull them together, and have made some important statements about the need to adhere to international human rights and standards, and not to fight back in the same manner that the military has, not to commit atrocities. So that's sort of how that's been going on. I'm not sure who to credit with saying this. I've read it in a couple different places or seen it, but people have made statements that the military has succeeded in doing what none of the opposition has been able to do over decades, and that is to unify all the various ethnic minority groups and a big chunk of the majority Baman people against the military. So you really have this widespread resistance. There remain major challenges for them to be able to really coordinate, but it's much more difficult than what the military calculated initially. And then I mentioned earlier that a sort of silver lining is how people have been thinking about the Rohingya in this, where there was just widespread stereotypes and racism against the Rohingya, where now there's much more empathy being seen, where people see okay, we see that, we know this military that is attacking us, we see what they did to the Rohingya, and we get it now. And then the NUG, the National Unity Government, coming out with a position on the Rohingya, saying that they can return, they will be able to return from Bangladesh, where some million are living in pretty dire conditions in camps, and that they will have a chance to get citizenship, which has really been the core of for years and decades. The Rohingya have been denied citizenship, or denied that they are from Myanmar originally. So that's some positive things. There's still some questions in the opposition movement of how inclusive they will be with including Rohingya, and things that need to be continued to be pushed with them, I think, and worked on. But all in all, if there's a little bit of a silver lining in what's happened here, it's been that increased empathy among the the various ethnic minority groups, and particularly in feelings toward the Rohingya.
So, in the absence of the work, in the world of global affairs, we all know the phrase of following money. I'm wondering if you could comment on the poppy trade and the control of the gem trade by the military elite as providing a continuing funding source for the military.
Yeah, it's it's something that's been recognized, and I know some of the sanctions that have gone on Myanmar are aimed at the gem trade, and had been for years, but renewed attention on that and on timber. That's one worry, is that there has been these illegal trade networks that have been going on for years in Myanmar and in the region, and with the sort of chaos that's going on now, there's worries of who's going to be controlling those. Is that and the ability to push back on the opium trade and trade of other drugs. So it's there's a murky world there, and it's not completely clear who's benefiting from that, but it's becoming more difficult in the chaos to kind of combat that. The same goes for worries about refugee flows and things that are going to affect the region, upticks in human trafficking, all these kinds of issues that are going to affect the region, which is what various advocates are trying to push with ASEAN countries to recognize that this is not just an issue that's happening within Myanmar. It's becoming increasingly impossible to ignore the fact that this really is affecting the entire region.
So you touched a little bit on China, but I'm wondering if you can explore a little further. What is Myanmar's relationship with China? And will US aid or any sort of intervention be dictated by our own diplomatic speed bumps with China?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. It's not, it's not a clear and easy answer of the relationship with China and Myanmar and the Myanmar military in particular. There's a lot of indications that China was not very happy with the military making this move. They had put in a lot of efforts to improve relationships with Aung San Suu Kyi and with the her NLD party. It's not 100% clear, that China is particularly happy, but what China is doing is really hedging. They have pushed back against the military and saying, don't make moves like, officially dissolving the NLD party. And, they still have a lot of influence with some of the ethnic armed groups along their border, along the Myanmar-China border. And so, and there's one of the big interests that China has had is its Belt and Road Initiative, this huge project to connect China with markets further afield, both in terms of oil and gas and trade and financing deep sea ports and things like that. That's all things that they were really investing in and working with the previous government in Myanmar. So they have an intense interest in where things go. So they're kind of trying to work both sides and hedge their bets. And I think that creates some potential opportunities. The other thing I'd point out is China has provided vaccines across the border to some of the ethnic armed groups. And so COVID vaccines. So there's a potential opening there. Maybe they can be engaged to allow for humanitarian aid to get across as well. But it's certainly they see Myanmar in terms of U.S. and China competition, but it's not 100% like where they are. So maybe there's some opportunity for engaging. And on the U.S. side, I think the U.S. for years has seen Myanmar very much, or at least a big part of the U.S. government has viewed Myanmar through the lens of Chinese influence and combating that or countering that, which partially I think has been given as a reason why they haven't moved forward on a genocide designation on the Rohingya. But I think at this point where you have the military that's already taken over with the coup, those worries don't really they don't really carry water. I don't think they did before, but especially not now, where the military clearly is not looking to improve its relationships with the U.S. and it's looking to appease China to the extent that it can to get the support to continue what it's been doing.
Well, so as a redirect, let's talk about the issue of the Uyghur genocide in China. And specifically the growing international outcry around this. Has this shaped the engagement or the lack thereof for China's relationship with Myanmar since the coup? And specifically, are they tiptoeing around this because of the issue of the dire treatment of the Rohingya?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and obviously, with the Olympics starting in China and a lot of attention with at least the diplomatic boycott that the U.S. and others have had of not sending high-level people. and China bristling at that. Obviously it's a very big topic right now, but it has been for years, the treatment of the Uyghurs. I think that in maybe not that specifically, but the broader concerns that China has about attacks on its own human rights records and what it's done internally partially explain why it might why it's not going to be attacking a country like Myanmar in terms of criticisms or recognition or allowing for a harsher language in UN Security Council resolutions. The other kind of interesting parallel that I've seen in the work that I've done between the Uyghurs and Rohingya is in the Trump administration, we really pushed hard with what we called a Call It Genocide campaign, along with over 100 other NGOs that signed on to letters. We had a legal expert letter that was signed by people who are at high levels of the Biden administration now, including Samantha Power. And we really pushed hard to get a genocide designation for the Rohingya with the Trump administration. We heard it was very, very close. You may recall that very much on the last days of the administration, they did make a Uyghur genocide determination, which was very welcome. But from what we heard, it was the attention that was going on that they didn't want to also make a Rohingya genocide determination, even though there's reams of evidence to push for that. But so I think that's something that the Biden administration they reinforced that determination on the Uyghurs, but they're still, despite Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, saying that they are actively assessing the genocide determination for the Rohingya, we haven't seen them come forward with that. And again, to bring it back to today, I think it just reinforces how important that is, to send a sign that you are going to recognize crimes that have happened, and you're going to deal with the impunity of the Myanmar military and send a strong signal. And that opens up for further accountability for the crimes that the junta has committed against other ethnic groups in Myanmar.
Well, so in some ways, you could see the declaring genocide in one area and not in another place is playing a card because we are threatened by the economic juggernaut that is China, and we don't see the same relationship with Myanmar. But I'm wondering if you can talk about Myanmar's overall economic situation and how that is affecting their domestic policies relative to the coup and the protests and their bilateral relations with its neighbors. I mean, the other country you haven't talked about is Japan, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on this a little bit earlier, of just that there's been some very serious economic mismanagement by the junta, and then exacerbated by the broad protests, the boycotts and strikes, and then now the sanctions and businesses announcing they're going to pull out. The junta has really is being pressed. They still have revenue flows, it's so they're not. I don't think they're in danger of falling or cracking in the immediate term. But the economy is as a whole is dire. I mean, the World Bank projections are, I mentioned that almost half the population is projected to be under poverty levels. So you've seen that the junta has reacted by forcibly trying to collect taxes or collect utility bills or things that people aren't paying, and so they're turning to more forceful ways to try to, so that kind of gives a little bit of a picture of the level of desperation that we're getting to. And it's affecting other countries as well. I mean, and Japan's role has been they've played a very forward-leaning role in before the coup on putting in development funding, and they've been a little more reticent to levy sanctions, and so I think there's the economic situation is going to affect not only Myanmar but the region, but there's additional economic levers that should be pulled to press the junta, but at the same time trying to, you know, make sure that any pressure is done smartly, that you're not you know, having the negative effects on the population. But again, as I mentioned, like in a large way, much of the population has made the decision to, you know, carry out those sanctions themselves effectively in the way that they can. So it's yeah, I mean, the economic situation is going to be very dire, and it's going to fit into all these other levels of crises that I mentioned earlier.
So this begs the question, is Myanmar a failing state, and should we be worried it is a danger to its neighbors?
Yeah, you know, different people have warned of it being a failed state. There's different discussions over whether, are they at civil war right now, or is this not the level of civil war? I think the short answer is absolutely they're a danger to their neighbors. I think the most likely scenario is that we're going to see what's happened so far continue. I don't, you know, it'll be a little bit of a stalemate where I don't see the military controlling the entire country anytime soon. And then at the same time, I don't see the opposition being able to unite to completely overthrow the military in the short term. So I think you're going to see, you know, a longer period of what we've seen, and the people who are really going to suffer from it is the people of Myanmar. You know, as we see more and more people being both displaced and in need of humanitarian aid. So you know, it just begs it goes back to those key the key urgency of the region, you know, recognizing those dangers as not something that's just going to stay in Myanmar. And then, you know, and then working with international allies to step up the pressure on the Myanmar military. And then in the meantime, doing all you can to mitigate the immediate suffering, including through that, pushing Thailand, India, other neighbors to allow for both cross-border humanitarian aid and refuge for people who are leaving the country.
So we're coming up on the end of the program. I want to ask one final question, which is, we like to bring things back onto what can we do in the face of such a big issue. So for US action, can you talk about the role that Congress can play, and what role can concerned citizens like this WorldOregon audience play in giving voice to the future of Myanmar?
Yeah, you know, the most immediate thing I think is the Burma Act that has been introduced both in the House and in the Senate. And I think, you know, just contacting your representatives to make sure that if they haven't already endorsed that and sponsored it, that they are, and if they have, then that they're actively you know, reaching out to other members of Congress to pass that. And then it's, you know, just raising this in awareness of what's going on in your local community, and then when you have opportunities to push, get things out, whether in local op-eds or things like that, and then pushing the Biden administration to be taking some of the actions it can take without waiting for the Burma Act to go forward. So I've mentioned all those things that we are, you know, the types of pressure and humanitarian aid that we're pushing for. But I think that Congress has a really important role to play. The Burma Act is there, but we're a year past the coup, so time is of the essence to get that passed. Great,
Daniel, thank you so much for a really rich perspective on such a complex issue. I want to bring Derek back in to take us out into the day. Thanks again to our audience for great questions, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Daniel. Excellent discussion. And we'd like to thank our partners at the Never Again Coalition. Daniel's a local group here that brings a lot of awareness to issues like the challenging situation in Myanmar, as well as others of genocide worldwide. So thank you again to Never Again and their leader, Lauren Fortgang. Daniel, appreciate you and Refugees International for being part of this series with the Foreign Policy Association. This talk will be up next week on our YouTube channel, where the other previous talks are. I'm posting here in the chat, encouraging you to look to our website to register for upcoming events. Notable coming up is on February 24th with OSU Professor Nichols on the pandemic and he is always a hit when we have him. He's so knowledgeable in comparing to the pandemic of 100 years ago, so I encourage you to join us for that. Wish everyone to stay safe, stay healthy. Daniel, we look forward to working with you on a future program. Thanks so much for joining us today.